Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning to learn more about on-farm food safety, including FSMA and GAP. Today we have with us Teresa Wiemerslage, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Field Specialist. She's joining us to share about produce safety programs, and she's going to discuss more about different programs and how they may fit into different operations. Teresa is a field specialist with the Farm, Food, and Enterprise Development Program at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. She has worked for ISU Extension for over 20 years in county, regional, and state positions and is based in the northeast corner of the state. In her current position, she specializes in food system development, food hubs, farm to school, and on-farm food safety. I would like to note that our ability to host this webinar is supported through a specialty crop block grant that SDSBA received through the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. We have 1 hour set aside for this webinar with time at the end for questions. You're welcome to put any questions that come to mind in the chat and we'll do our best to have them answered. With that, I will turn it over to Teresa.
Thanks, Morgan. Glad to be here today to talk to you guys about GAP food safety and all the different pieces that go into that. There's usually a lot of questions from producers when they first call me to talk about what does I need to be GAP certified? What do I need to do? What does that look like on my farm? So I'm going to go through the different pieces today and discuss some different options for folks and how all these food safety programs fit into each other. I've been working on GAP food safety, trying to crack this nut for most of my career. I started down this path because of that exact scenario I just mentioned, where a farmer called and said, we need to be GAP certified. How do we do that? So during my journey, I've become very familiar with the USDA GAP audit program, the group GAP program, and now some of the other third-party programs. So let's dive in and take a look and see how food safety builds on each other. So my presentation today is built around the idea, and I'm gonna come back to this chart several times. Because when we talk about food safety, I believe that the programs fit together in layers. So good agricultural practices or GAPs are the foundation of every farm food safety practice. Those are the things that you do on your farm to minimize transfer of foodborne pathogens. And I can guarantee that every farm is doing some sort of GAP already. It's just acknowledging what are the different things that you're doing. For instance, a very basic one is hand washing, making sure employees are washing their hands. Cleaning and sanitizing is a good agricultural practice. There's practices around the use of manure on farms, use of water and different types of water for irrigation. So those good agricultural practices are the foundation. It's the basic science behind food safety. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the FSMA produce safety rule, which is now the federal rule regarding produce safety. And then we're going to end the presentation talking about third-party GAP audits, which at this point in time are voluntary, but the industry, certain buyers in the industry require them in order for farmers to sell to them. So let's start with good agricultural practices. Why is this important? Well, first of all, we want healthy people, right? We know that in order to have healthy people, they need to eat, have a lot of fruits and vegetables in their diet. So in order to get that nutrition, that fresh product is important. At the same time, we know that fresh produce has its own risks because there is not a kill step or a cook step to it. So we want to make sure that any fresh product going into the market is not introducing illness. Good agricultural practices also help protect your farm and your reputation. Nobody wants to be known for a product that has made someone sick. And finally, what in my experience with helping farmers through their food safety efforts, Many of them come back after their first year and say, this has really helped me stay organized. I feel like I'm a better manager now that I have implemented this management plan. So foodborne illnesses in the US, each year, 1 out of 6 Americans gets an illness. Now, many times that illness is just a stomach ache, or you're down and out for a few hours or a few days. Many of them do not get reported, but their foodborne illnesses for some people can result in hospitalizations over $128,000 or $28,000 per year. And some people actually die from something that they ate. So produce food safety is all about making sure that we're minimizing the transition of those foodborne pathogens. What are these symptoms of foodborne illnesses that we're talking about? It ranges from diarrhea, fever, fatigue, and nausea. Sometimes there's abdominal cramps, headaches, vomiting, chills, or muscle aches can all be symptoms of someone with a foodborne illness. And when we talk about foodborne illnesses, we know that there's a certain segment of the population that is more at risk. So it's the folks who are immunocompromised, those who are going through chemotherapy or have had transplants. The very old have a decreased immune function. The pregnant women and the very young, the babies and the toddlers who don't have fully developed immune systems are all at high risk. So when we think about where you're marketing your produce, are you trying to sell to hospitals, nursing homes, schools, or preschools? Those are where the immunocompromised or the high-risk populations are. So we want to make sure that any food that goes into those facilities is of the highest quality. That's also why we see so many of the buyers, selling to a hospital or a nursing home are going to require third-party GAP certification, just as an extra layer of that validation and verification. Produce introduces its own set of food safety challenges. It's often consumed raw, so there is not a cook step or a clean step in order to get rid of any pathogens. We were just on a team call this morning talking about all the flooding in Northwest Iowa. And what happens to flooded produce? What does adulterated human food and animal food look like? And what's required? And one of the points that we brought out to our community partners is that contaminated produce cannot be uncontaminated. There is not anything that you can do to treat contaminated produce and make it edible. So we want to make sure, aside from a cook step, so we want to make sure that any contamination that's potentially there, the risk is minimized and it doesn't spread and cross-contaminate more product. We know that contamination is often sporadic in fields. It's not going to be the whole acre of broccoli that has contamination. It's likely just 1 or 2 or a segmented or a certain area of the field where the deer browsed or the birds came in. That is where the contamination may start. So we want to make sure that we're looking at inspecting those fields before harvest and making sure that we're looking at the product before it leaves the field. We know that microbial contamination is extremely difficult to remove once it's present. There are lots of nooks and crannies and bruises and cuts on produce where those microbes like to hide. And as much as you scrub and clean, we're not going to be able to remove it. We also know that bacteria can multiply on produce surfaces and in those wounds under the right conditions. That's why so many farms spend a lot of time getting their product picked, cooled, and stored with cooler temperatures to minimize that bacteria growth so that we slow it down in the case that there is any bacteria present. So when we talk about contamination sources, I like to tell people there's 4 ways, right? There's the ways that walk into your field. through the animals or through the humans. Those are two potential contamination sources. And then there's two universal contamination sources. You know, the soil that the crop is grown in can have microbes, manure, pathogens, as well as the water. The water that you use to grow in the field, as well as the water that you use to clean your produce, can introduce contamination and introduce it very quickly. Now, the part here down at the bottom, the building, the equipment, and the tools, and the people, the workers, are all ways that cross-contamination happens, right? So if the water's contaminated, the buildings, equipment, and tools can also spread that contamination to the produce. Now, in the food safety world, we talk about general best practices, and the audits, the inspection lists, the trainings generally fall into these categories. So there will be specific lessons or specific practices around worker training. They do assessments around soil amendments. You know, it is okay to use manure on your fields, but manure could have human pathogens in it. So we want to make sure that we're using it in a way that does not introduce contamination into the food chain. GAP also addresses animal risks and looks at what does animals in the field, what kind of risk or hazard have they introduced. They'll look at water, harvesting best practices, as well as post-harvest best practices. You know, what are the activities that are happening in the field, as well as the ones that happen once that produce moves to the pack house. And finally, under GAP, they'll talk about traceability. So in the event of when something or if something goes wrong, are you able to trace that specific lot of produce both one step backward, find out where that product came from, where it was harvested from, and who harvested it, and one step forward, where did that product go once it left your farm? Did it go to a grocery store, a restaurant? Being able to trace that product one step forward, one step backward is part of that traceability. When we talk about produce safety, the GAP process can intervene at different steps. So the first step is to assess the different risks on your farm. The second step is to implement practices that can reduce those risks. You know, maybe it's cleaning and sanitizing, that it could include worker training. The third step is to monitor your practices. The things that you put in place, are they working? Are the restrooms being cleaned? Are the cleaning schedules that you set up for your pack house, are they being followed? The fourth step is to use corrective actions in the event that something goes wrong or something is trending towards wrong, right? So corrective actions would be there was an issue with the cleanliness of one of the restrooms, or our water sanitizer was being used too quickly. What was the root cause of that problem? And finally, how we verify that all this is happening and working is through record keeping. Those 5 steps are the basic pieces to a good, robust food safety program. All right, that was a general overview of good agricultural practices and what they can look like. If you would ever go to a GAPS class or training, they're going to hit in more detail and give you more examples of some of those practices. So let's move to the next level, which is the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. FSMA stands for Food Safety Modernization Act. It was signed into law in 2011, but really started being implemented in 2015. FSMA is actually 7 rules. The one that we're going to focus on today is the Produce Safety Rule. It was the first time in our history that there was actually regulations around fresh produce. Up until this time, it was just penalties for contamination events. The other 6 rules had already been in place, but they were updated with some of the new science and the new language around the food industry. So there are distinct pieces and distinct regulatory parts for each of those rules. When I lead produce safety rule trainings, we often get a lot of questions related to food processing and what happens if that produce is cut or made into something different. And at that point, we have to jump to the next rule, because that's when preventive controls for humans food comes into play. So produce safety rule is really just for that farm-based whole raw commodity part of the production system. So what is the scope of the produce safety rule? It's the first ever mandatory federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, or holding fresh produce. So if you're a farm or facility, and in some cases, food hubs, packing houses, if you're doing any growing, harvesting, packing, or holding of fresh produce, the produce safety rule may apply to you. Some growers may be eligible for exemptions to the produce safety rule or even excluded from the rule, depending on what they grow. So there are some foods that are exempt from the rule because they're rarely consumed raw. They're usually, the majority of the crop goes through a kill step or a cooking step, so they're exempt. Examples of that would be potatoes or sweet corn, are examples of foods that are what we call not covered by the rule. Some crops, if a farm is raising produce that will primarily go into a processor or have a kill step applied to that product, those crops may be exempt from the rule. There's also exemptions based on your farm size. So how much produce do you sell in a year, and where is that food going? Bottom line, when it comes to the produce safety rule, all growers should understand and take action to reduce their food safety risks on the farm. So this graphic is an attempt to simplify a pretty complex rule. If you notice, I've still got my triangle here, right? At the bottom is the good agricultural practices, which is the foundation for all farm food safety. At the top, we have that third-party certification. And in the middle is what I call the 3 buckets that farms fit into when it comes to the produce safety rule. On the left, you're going to have farms that are covered by the rule. So if they are growing what we call covered produce that is consumed raw, and they grow a certain dollar amount of that, as well as market it further than 275 miles, they're generally going to be considered covered farms. Down here at the bottom is the note. These are usually the larger or the wholesale type farms that are going to be covered. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what we call the exempt farms. There are no rules or requirements for those producers. They are usually smaller producers and sell under $25,000 in annual produce to be excluded from the rule. Now, this $25,000 is adjusted for inflation. So 25,000 was when the rule came out. The inflated number nowadays is more around 35,000. If you feel like you still fit in that exemption, you can contact your produce safety folks in your state or me. I'll take those questions too to find out if you're still exempt from the rule. Then there's this group of folks in the middle, which we call qualified exempt farms. There are certain sales numbers to this requirement, as well as it takes into account how much you sell direct to consumer. the parts of the rule that apply to these qualified exempt farms, there's a labeling requirement, and you need to keep your sales records to document your exemption. So these types of farms are generally between $25,000 and $500,000 in annual food sales, and those food sales need to go to qualified end users. Qualified end users are generally direct to consumer, grocery store or restaurant. Again, the folks in your state extension folks can help you walk through these requirements. There's also a handy spreadsheet that explains those procedures. So once you figure out where you fit, it'll dictate where you move, how you respond, or what type of plan you put into place for food safety on your farm. This is the flow chart that's available through the FDA that walks you through all those little tiny exemptions and exclusions to the produce safety rule. The link is here on the page if you want to look it up for yourself. I also put some of the rarely consumed raw foods on here for Iowa. I would assume that a lot of them are similar for South Dakota. These are foods that are going to be exempt from the rule because there's usually, they're rarely consumed raw. The rule does not apply to them. What's the best way to learn more about produce safety rule? It's to attend a PSA grower training. This is an 8-hour class. It takes us a full day to go through all the different modules and all the different aspects of the produce safety rule. It's also a really good introduction to good agricultural practices if you've never had that type of training. In Iowa, we offer 3 to 6 trainings per year, both in person and remotely. In the past, we've partnered with Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota to allow those farmers to participate in our trainings. So those are an option for folks if there isn't a South Dakota specific training for you. At the end of the training, you get a certificate of completion, which at this point in time is good for life. So you would want to keep that certificate on file to prove that you've met the law's requirement of having a certified, qualified individual. Another way to say that is it's one way to meet the rules requirement that one person from a covered farm attends an approved training course. All right, ready to move on to the next piece. So now we've reviewed the basic rule that's out there for farmers, for certain farmers that they need to follow. The next layer is third-party GAP certification. There's a lot of text on this slide, but I'm gonna go through the pieces just to compare the FSMA produce safety rule and GAP, because I think it outlines it really well and helps tell the difference between the two programs. Now, there are going to be some farms that are covered by the FSMA produce safety rule that will also do third-party GAP certification. There are going to be some farms that do third-party GAP certification that are exempt or qualified exempt from the produce safety rule. So they're all the scenarios mixed together, there's not a clear path for everybody. You can take the pieces and mix and match them as you go. All right, so FSMA is a law of the United States. GAP is generally accepted across the globe. Canadian farmers, Mexican farmers may all be subject to GAP certification. The FSMA is the rule related to produce food safety, and right now GAP is still what we consider to be voluntary, although some farmers may feel like it's mandatory for them in order to access a certain market. FSMA inspections are generally unannounced, although you will get here in Iowa, farmers usually get a week's notice that their inspector is coming to their farm. With GAP, you generally schedule your audit with your auditor. FSMA is overseen by the FDA, and in GAP, there are private companies as well as USDA and state Department of Ag's folks that all do GAP audits. In FSMA, there are exemptions for farms that sell less than $25,000 worth of produce. But on the GAP side, the audits are driven by the buyers. If you want to sell to Walmart, you're going to need a GAP audit. When it comes to what crops are covered, FSMA puts everything into one bucket. So when they come to a farm, they look at all the crops, both covered and not covered, although the covered ones are the ones that they're looking at the hardest. With GAP, you can be crop specific. So I have farms that are doing GAP audits because they want to sell tomatoes to Whole Foods. So even though they grow 20 different crops, when I go there to do an audit for them, we're only looking at the tomato crop specifically. When it comes to the food safety plan and risk assessment, FSMA does not require a food safety plan, but GAP does. A food safety plan is still the best way to get your ducks in a row when it comes to your practices, and what you're implementing for good agricultural practices. But it's important to know it's required for a GAP audit, and it's optional for FSMA inspections. Both programs need to have designated food safety officers. Traceability is a requirement for GAP, as well as a mock recall every year. And then both programs address worker health and hygiene training programs and documentation programs. So when we say GAP certification, we're really talking about third-party GAP audits. Again, they're voluntary, they're points-based, so you have a big long checklist of things that the auditor is going to look at. You need to score 80% to pass. There are some programs like the USDA GAP program has mandatory questions. So you also need to be marked compliant for all those mandatory questions in order to pass. GAP certification is usually buyer driven. I mentioned that several times. If you want to get into a hospital or sell your product into a distributor, usually you're going to have a GAP certificate. There are different companies that provide that certification. USDA is one of the auditing companies, but you may also hear of Primus Audits, Global GAP, or Quality Fresh are all the other companies that can do audits. They range in price from $500 a year to over $1,400. In the case of the USDA, they bill by the hour. So they include travel time as well as the time they stay on your farm, as well as time spent preparing your final report. There are cost share programs available by some states, and currently Farm Service Agency also has a cost share program. So even in South Dakota, if you have a GAP audit, you can apply for cost share for those audit costs. And again, the GAP audits are conducted by crop. It's not usually a whole farm situation. When you call to schedule an audit, the auditor will talk to you about, well, what are we auditing? What are we looking at? Those are the activities and practices we'll want to see. There are different types of third-party GAP audits that you can participate in. So just like there's different companies that do the audits, there are actually different types of audits as well. The old standard, the type of audit that was around when I started this work 20 years ago was the USDA GAP GIP audit. good agriculture practices, good handling practices audit. Those are still around in some states. They are being phased out. The USDA is no longer currently updating that audit, and most buyers have now moved to what we call the harmonized audit. The harmonized audit was created when a bunch of buyers and farmers got together and said, you know what, this is ridiculous that I have to have a third-party audit for this company and this company and this company. Isn't there one type of audit that we could all agree to will meet the requirements of everybody? So in other words, can't we come up with something that is universal? So that's where the harmonized, getting along, the harmonized GAP audit comes into play. The advantage of the harmonized GAP audit is that it's been aligned with the FSMA produce safety rule. That doesn't mean it's a replacement. So, but it does mean that it's looking for very similar things. So it's not a substitution for a FSMA inspection, but if you are getting a harmonized GAP audit, you are the majority of the way to your goal of being able to also pass a FSMA inspection. There are also, there's a variation of the harmonized GAP Audit Plus, which has a few more pieces to it. It's a little bit more technical. And then there's, for mushroom growers, they have their own program and their own audit criteria that they look at. So different types of programs. The take home on this one is, for us here in Iowa, most of our growers have moved to a harmonized GAP audit. That tends to be where the industry expectation is at this point. I also want to mention group GAP is out there. Morgan had said that some folks have been talking about group GAP in the state. When group GAP was introduced through the USDA as a pilot program, it seemed like a really good idea. It met that criteria of a more affordable audit for farmers. And it puts more of the responsibility for food safety within that group. So the way a group is set up is you have a group of farms, you have a group administrator that manages and creates what we call a QMS, a quality management system. All the growers, that quality management system manages all the documents, how members are brought in, any disciplinary procedures, as well as how do you do audits for the group each year. With USDA group GAP, there are internal auditors within that group. So maybe it would be a couple of the farmers have been trained to be GAP auditors. Those internal auditors would audit every farm in the group each year. And then the USDA would come in every year and do a sample of those farms. So it's usually the square root. So if you have 49 farms in a group, 7 of those farms would be audited by the USDA as well. So they would have 2 audits that year. What we found through the pilot process is we were able to hone in on what does it cost to run a group, both financially as well as what are the human resources involved to manage a group like that. And what we found in Iowa when we ran our group GAP system is that you need about 50 farmers, 50 members in order to justify the time and the investment, the cost of running a group GAP program. So while it may be a good fit for certain groups, you're not going to be able to run a group on just a handful of farmers. The cost savings is not there for that type of, the cost savings isn't there for that. All right, so we've talked about the FSMA produce safety rule. We've talked about third-party GAP audits. The key for both to managing a good on-farm food safety plan, in my opinion, is having a written food safety plan. It helps you be organized in your food safety efforts. And in the case of GAP certification, it's required because auditors are going to look at what is your policy for hand washing? What is your policy for worker training? And they're going to observe the practices on your farm to make sure that you're doing what you have written. It is also the best way to be prepared for any buyer's questions or requirements, and it helps you meet those food safety regulations, the requirements of the produce safety rule where they have those food safety requirements. So what's in a food safety plan? There are lots of different examples of templates out there for small farms to use for food safety. Generally, they'll include farm maps. They'll have example policies in them, standard operating procedures, which are how to-do lists. So an SOP for how do we clean the brush washer, or what is our standard operating procedure for washing lettuce. Those would all be included in your farm food safety plan, as well as records like worker training, any water tests that you do. It'll have lists of emergency contact information, your buyers and suppliers. Traceability and recall are part of your food safety plan, as well as contact information for any contracted services. Like I said, there are a lot of different examples of plans out there. The key part is to make that plan yours. So when you get that plan, it's fully expected you're going to delete parts of it. If you're not using manure, you don't need to have manure language in your plan. If you're not washing your produce, you don't need to have the washing pieces in there. Only include the practices that you're doing on your farm. Do not include the things you wish you are doing. They can be good goals and you can add them later, but your plan should be about the here and now. Think of it like the book of in case. So what happens if the farm owner operator has to leave for a few days? What if there are questions on how certain things run on your farm? This would be the way to document all of those operations and practices. Pick practices and schedules you know you can do. When I run food safety plan classes, inevitably people are getting to work, filling out the template, and one of the first sections we always get to is the restroom cleaning section. And there is no prescription. The rule or GAP, they do not prescribe how often you need to clean your restroom. It just says it needs to be clean. So a farmer will ask, well, how often should I clean my restroom? And I always answer that back with a question. Well, how often do you clean your restroom? That should be your schedule. Make it fit to what you're currently already doing and not necessarily what you feel you need to be doing. Where is your comfort level? Where do you feel like you're meeting the requirement of having a clean restroom? And always focus on risk reduction and those practices that will make the biggest impact first. In conclusion, produce safety begins with your commitment, identifying the risks on your farm, supporting policies and practices to reduce those risks. Sometimes that's going to require additional manpower. Sometimes it'll require an investment in equipment. Support effective food safety training so everyone can be involved in reducing those risks on your farm, and make sure you set a good and consistent example of what you're expecting on your farm, because just like children are always watching, the workers are always watching too. So that was a really short and quick trip through GAP food safety. Checking to see if there are any questions that I can talk through with folks.
I don't see any in the chat yet. I'm going to allow all the participants to unmute themselves. So feel free to ask questions either in the chat feature or unmute yourself and ask. I guess in the meantime, do you have any information on upcoming trainings, the ones that you mentioned about food safety? Are there any currently scheduled, or when do those usually take place?
Well, we tend to run our programs in the winter time when farmers are not busy out in their fields. There are remote trainings being offered right now. If you go to the Produce Safety Alliance website, there are trainings that you can join. Pay attention to the cost, because every state has different level of cost. Now, here in Iowa, we've always offered our trainings in the winter. So November through March is when we tend to set our training dates. We're in the process of getting those set here in July. So we'll have dates fairly soon, so farmers can think about that. But yeah.
And you talked a little bit about your experience with Group Gap in Iowa. And I think in a previous conversation we had, you had told me about some other states that had tried GAP as well. Do you know of anywhere that's currently successfully doing Group GAP?
There's a group in New Mexico. There's a group in Hawaii. There are some new groups, I think, starting in Wisconsin. The biggest hurdle is with Group Gap, there's so much administration that goes into managing that group. That's really the burden part of it. I think people get into Group Gap because they think it's going to be cheaper. And what we found is it's not cheaper unless you get to a certain size. You're better off looking at one of the other options. Now, unfortunately, South Dakota is similar in Iowa in that we don't have a state GAP program. So if you want an audit, a USDA audit, it usually requires a out-of-state person coming in to do your audit. One way you can manage the cost is to find a friend, another farmer that needs an audit about the same time, because the USDA will share their travel costs between those two farms. But otherwise, yeah, a USDA audit includes both the time they spend on your farm, which is generally 2 to 3 hours, depending on how big you are. And then any travel time, how long it takes them to come. So that's one way to manage it. There are other companies out there that will offer cheaper levels, but you have to go back to your buyer and ask, what type of program, what type of audit is acceptable to you.
I had actually seen that the program in Hawaii, and if I'm not mistaken, they do the GAP, but they also have like a food hub. Like it's more than just running GAP, which is probably helpful when we talk about those administrative costs. Adding more services and resources for the producers under one umbrella, rather than just GAP.
The group that we ran in Iowa under that pilot program was with the food hub. So Iowa Food Hub was the group administrator for that. I was actually their administrator. But everything, they were the contractor with the USDA, and then they were responsible for recruiting and auditing the farms. They did not have the requirement that you had to be a vendor to the food hub. They were taking this as part of their nonprofit mission of reaching out and helping as many farmers as possible. So about half of the farms in the group actually did not sell through the food hub, but they were contributing to the costs of running the group. So it's a great role for a food hub to offer if they're in that position. Now, I would think the nonprofit food hubs would have that closer in their mission than the ones that are trying to run as an LLC or a for-profit model. Because the nonprofits are able to go after grants and additional funding to help subsidize that for the farmers instead of just relying the farmers to cover all that cost. But it's an option. It's just we've learned a lot in the 15 years since Group GAP was introduced.
It's interesting that with the food hub model, half were selling to the food hub. What do you think played into that decision? Did they just already have other buyers that were requiring GAP, so they joined to meet those requirements?
The the decision was more along the lines of providing an affordable option for farms in Iowa, because we were at that position of bringing in USDA auditors to do all the audits, and it was getting really expensive. So we went down the path of, if we can coordinate a group for Iowa farmers to be able to manage the cost, maybe that's the solution for this. Maybe we can get more farms audited because it's not so expensive. And we did that for 5 years before couldn't make the cost. There was no cost advantage after 5 years of running our own group versus everybody going out on their own.
Maybe my question was a little unclear. I'm speaking to the producer side. Did you have any insight of what made the producer's decision of selling to the food hub or other buyers? Like, did they already have other buyers that required GAP and they were joining the group GAP to fulfill that?
Yes. Yeah. For those farms that were not food hub vendors, they had a buyer that was asking for GAP certification. So this wasn't an option for them to do it, get a more affordable audit.
Any other questions? I don't see any coming through, but thank you again for everyone for joining us, and thank you, Teresa, for taking the time to discuss and educate our listeners. As you all exit the webinar, you'll be directed to a post survey. If you could take a few minutes to respond, it would be greatly appreciated for reporting purposes and as we create future programming. And if you're watching the recording, it can be found in the caption beneath this video. So thank you again for joining, and thank you, Teresa, for sharing your knowledge.
Happy to help. Also happy to, if people want to reach out to me directly, feel free to do that.